In 2 Corinthians 4:4, we read, "In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers." James White and others say that this refers to Yahweh, who has blinded the hearts of unbelievers himself. Others, the majority of commentators, say that this refers to Satan. Can we refer to Satan as the God of this world? Let's take a look. This is the Bible Sojourner, where we discuss issues related to the Bible, theology, and culture. I'm your host, Peter Gaiman, professor of Old Testament and Biblical Languages at Shepherd's Theological Seminary. Shalom and welcome. Thanks for joining. Welcome back to another episode of the Bible Sojourner. We have an exciting topic today. We are going to be talking about the God of this world and what the referent could be. About a month ago, I did a presentation at the Shepherd's 360 conference on Satan's role and his responsibility in the world. And one text that I used was 2 Corinthians 4:4, which in my lecture I simply mentioned it referred to Satan and made that assumption. But it does need to be defended, and so that's what we're going to do today is we're actually going to look at this view. And part of the reason for that is because I've had some friends reach out to me giving me their input on this, and I have I have much respect for the friends that disagree with me on this. And I would also say that James White also takes an alternative view on this, and he makes a compelling case that 2 Corinthians 4:4 should refer to Yahweh rather than Satan. And so I think it's worthwhile talking about, working through the issue. And the best exegetical defense that I can find of the view that this passage, 2 Corinthians 4:4, and the phrase, the God of this world, is referring to Yahweh, not to Satan, is a regional ETS paper that is written by Donald E. Hartley. So if you're watching here, I'm going to put it on the screen. And here it is. And I'll put a link because it is available online. So I'll put a link in the show notes. So it's 2 Corinthians 4:4, a case for Yahweh as the God of this age. So it's written by Donald Hartley, and it was presented at a regional ETS meeting. And actually, it looks like it was the annual meeting of the ETS. So apparently it was presented at the annual meeting, not the regional. For some reason, I thought it was a regional meeting, but now that I'm looking at it, it looks like it was an annual meeting. And so he writes a robust defense of this, and I think that we want to go through this with care. And one of the things that I like to do is research the authors, and I don't know a lot about Donald Hartley, other than that he's a Dallas grad, has a PhD from there. He has written some things against King James onlyism that I could find, and so obviously I appreciate that kind of discussion that he's able to bring on that. I know that he has taught at various places at various times, but I'm not really, other than where he currently is, and what he does, I'm not really sure. I know that he wrote his dissertation on the wisdom background and parabolic implications of Isaiah 6:9-10 in the Synoptics. So talking about the connection of Isaiah 6:9-10 as it's used by the gospel writers, which he actually ties that passage into 2 Corinthians 4:4, which I think he does a really good job talking about some of the parallels there. So I really appreciate that. And so I want to try to represent his arguments. I won't be going through everything that he says because I'm going to summarize a lot of it. I mean, this is 22 pages, so we won't be able to go through all of it. But the outline that he follows is he basically gives a historical analysis of the different people who've held the viewpoints, and then he gives his arguments against why the God of this world should not refer to Satan. And then he makes his arguments for why it should refer to Yahweh. So I'm going to reverse that a little bit because I think I want to really try to understand his argument and put it forward and walk through it and then point out where I think it's strong and weak and all that, and then walk through why I think ultimately the God of this world or the God of this age should be a reference to Satan. Okay, so that's kind of our plan moving forward. And I do want to say out of the gate here that I do think that this is one of those issues where disagreement is completely within line of different doctrinal camps. I mean, you could have somebody who agrees on very much, almost anything, and you could have disagreement here. I don't think this is a hill to die on, as it were. But I do think it is worthwhile trying to get Scripture right and work through these things. And I find myself in a unenviable position of defending Satan in some regard. But one of the things I think most people would agree on is that Scripture regularly talks about God being in control of things from a sovereignty standpoint. He is sovereign, and I would hold that. But God often uses Satan to accomplish his will, and he uses secondary causation. And so we do need to broach that subject a little bit as well, okay? And so we will talk both from theological perspective as well as exegetical, walk through some of these issues. And we're going to try to do it as quick as possible. One of the reasons for it is just I don't have a lot of time to do a podcast today, but I did make it my goal to do it. So we are going to go as fast as possible. And so that's kind of the goal, if you will. So let's jump right in and let's talk about the arguments for Yahweh, okay? So one of the first arguments that is brought forward, and I've organized them in a rough order of how I think that we should think about it in order to maximize their effectiveness, perhaps. Somebody could disagree on how I present the arguments forward, but the first thing that I think is really, really helpful to think about is there is evidence within 2 Corinthians of Yahweh hardening the minds of individuals. So this is brought forward in 2 Corinthians 3:14. And bringing that up on my screen here, I'm just going to read from the ESV, and it says, "But their minds were hardened. For to this day, when they read the Old Covenant, that same veil remains unlifted because only through Christ is it taken away." And so I think, although it doesn't specifically say that God hardened, the minds of these Jewish individuals who are resisting the new covenant, resisting Christ and all of that, they're turning their back on Moses in some ways, that which Moses had revealed spoke about Christ. And so their minds were hardened. But I think you could make a case, and I think that that's what you would want to do, is make a case that this is kind of a divine passive. It doesn't say God himself is doing this, hardening their minds. But admittedly, I don't see a problem with saying God is the one who's doing that. Now, I will say, even if you make a case saying, well, God isn't doing that, it's kind of the Pharaoh syndrome where Pharaoh is hardening his own heart, and then God is also hardening his heart. Whatever. You want to play that game, that's fine. But in order to maximize the strength of the argument, I would just, for the sake of argument, say, okay, let's assume that God is the one who's doing this. I don't think that's, outlandish. In fact, even with the Pharaoh example of his heart being hardened, you walk through the narrative, there's many times where it says Pharaoh's heart was hardened, just generically. It says that God himself will cause the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. And then it also says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. So I think all of those can be true at the same time. And so regardless, theologically, there's no problem with having, the Lord being the one who hardens the mind or makes it difficult for someone to understand. So that is an issue here. And so looking at 2 Corinthians 3:14, in order to maximize, the effectiveness of this argument, say, well, look, already there's been an understanding in Scripture that Yahweh is the one who hardens the hearts and minds of individuals. And then so when you get to 2 Corinthians 4:4, which I'm putting on the screen now, in their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. Okay? So you could make the case then that the God of this world blinding the minds of unbelievers, same kind of idea, blinding the minds. There's a thematic parallel there, going back to the previous section, 2 Corinthians 3:14. It's the same idea there. Their minds were hardened, right? So you kind of have a very strong thematic connection, at least with regard to that. Now, I don't really have much to say against that kind of reasoning. I would say it's really good to look for internal evidence which complements one another within the book of the Bible that you are assessing, right? So I think that that's a really good argument. I think you could make the case, well, if God is doing it there, maybe God is doing it here, okay? So I think that that's a helpful argument to make. And I would say, although it's not definitive, because the difficulty is that God explicitly is not said explicitly in 2 Corinthians 3 to be the one who's hardening the mind. You do have the connection there of the thoughts mind, that connection, but with regard to other connections, it's more thematic than it is actual verbal. Okay, so there's no intrinsic vocabulary connections other than the mind being present there. That's hardened, and that's a real connection, but it's not as strong as it could be. Okay, so but that is a real connection. I think that we would want to say, yeah, that's a fair point. The second argument that's often thrown out, and I think that this one deserves a little more pushback, is it's phrased this way by Hartley, is that the articular form of God, ha theos, so in Greek, the word ha or ho, depending on your pronunciation where you learned Greek, ho theos, it never refers to the devil or Satan, okay? So we have no examples where the articular form of theos would refer to the devil or Satan. Unless, well, admittedly, unless this was it, right? But the big deal that's often made is the articular use, because you can actually go through, and I went through some Septuagintal renderings of, there are lots of examples. In fact, I actually can't remember which one it was. Yes, in 2 Kings 1, in 2 Kings 1, verses 3 and 4, you have the messengers for Ahaziah going to inquire of Baal-zebub. And as he goes, or as the messengers go, the angel of the Lord said to Elijah, "Arise, go to meet the messengers, and say, is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire in Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron?" Okay? Now, the phrase there, the god of Ekron, very clearly is a reference to non-Yahweh. Okay, so it's singular. It has a definitive nature to it, the god of Ekron. And so in one sense, and by the way, the Baal-zebub does have a connection even in the New Testament to Satan, basically. So when somebody is arguing, okay, it never refers to Satan, the article, yes, technically, if you were to look at this in the Septuagint, the article does not exist here, but it is basically definitive because Ekron is a place name. So it's a definite usage. You wouldn't necessarily need the article. So in that regard, it's not just a god from Ekron, but it's actually Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron. And so Hebrew bears that out too. So obviously Greek is a translation of the Hebrew. That's part of the difficulty in this discussion, is that you can't just think about it with regard to, okay, can we search ha theos everywhere? Does it refer to Satan? Does it refer? I mean, it's broader than that. In fact, what you should broaden it, you should tweak this, and I'll make more comments about this in a little bit as we go, but this kind of argument should be tweaked. You shouldn't say, does this ever refer to Satan? But you should you should ask, does ha theos ever refer to anything other than God? Because if it does, if you can find other examples of that, then this could be an example where it refers to something other than God. Okay, so notice the slight difference in the argument there is, yes, we may not be able to definitively prove that Satan is being referred to here, but does Paul or any of the other writers ever refer to ha theos outside of a reference to God? Okay, that's the real crucial component there, because this is a very strong argument if ha theos always refers to God, okay, with the article. But I will go ahead and throw this out there. Spoiler alert, it does not always refer to God. Even Paul, and we'll circle back to this argument, but I do want to point it out here, that Philippians 3:17, Paul uses the articular form of theos, ha theos, in reference to a generic God, but he's making reference to the belly, saying their God is their belly. That's how the English translation renders it, and he's using that same Greek construction. So that would definitively prove that, okay, ha theos can be expanded to refer to other entities besides just Yahweh. Okay, so that's important because a lot of people rely on that, saying, hey, the articular form of theos, always refers to God. That's not true. It definitively does not always refer to God. And, you look at the Old Testament and New Testament, the Old Testament writers and New Testament writers will regularly use theos to refer to, other deities, false gods, even inanimate objects like one's belly, right? So we need to understand that. Okay. Number 3 that's often brought out is that the expression ruler of this world in John is significantly different than Paul's God of this world. Okay. Now, the point here is, if you look at John, there is a similar phrase that John uses, and we'll make another expression about that later. But throughout the latter part of John, you have this very clear identification of Satan being the ruler of this world. But the arguments that are brought out there is that the word for ruler, archon, is different than theos. Okay, archon is different than theos, and John uses the word cosmos for the word for world rather than the ion, which is what you find in 2 Corinthians 4:4 under Paul. Okay, and then there's and I think that those are good observations, recognizing that there are different words that are being used, right? And there's also this idea that, okay, we need to define, or we need to avoid defining, I should say, Paul's terminology by John. Okay, and that's true. We can't just immediately jump to another author saying this is how we should define the things. That's true, but basically, what we're trying to do is not redefine things, but we're simply trying to assess the acceptability of whether or not we could title Satan as a ruler or, the world god. Okay. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do. We're not necessarily trying to, redefine things that way. But I would also say, just to the first 2 points, that there's a cosmos versus ion vocabulary difference. I think that we ought to think a little. Well, I kind of want to talk about this more in regard to positive arguments for this, but I'll say it this way. Okay, so just as far as the arguments are concerned, it is important to recognize the difference in vocabulary, but there are reasons for why those differences may exist. And so we need to double check our presuppositions on that. Okay, so that's the big takeaway. Is yes, you can observe a difference between cosmos and ion, but for example, does John ever use ion? And spoiler alert, he doesn't. So if John never uses that word, John is actually really, he's kind of unique in some of the ways that he does Greek. So if he never uses, he writes a lot. He's got the Gospel of John, he's got 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, he's got Revelation. If he never uses ion in a reference to the world, then, we should consider, okay, maybe that's just not what he's going to be doing. Okay. So we need to recognize that. And Paul, on the other hand, uses both. So there's an interesting, explanation for that, or at least an interesting observation that requires an explanation. Okay. All right. Also, Paul, and this is the argument that fits in with this category, is that Paul also refers to the devil and Satan using the same term that John does, archon, ruler. So in Ephesians 2:2, Paul refers to Satan as, the prince of the power of the air is often how it's translated, the ruler. And so the thought goes that Paul does use the term archon. So the fact that he's not using archon here would be a strong argument against the fact that he would be referring to Satan here. Okay. And I think that's legitimate. And we do need to consider, why is Paul using certain phrases at certain times? All right. So I do think that is a valid consideration. And I ultimately think that there's more parallels between the ruler of this world and Paul's God of this world, even though they do use different terms. But the parallels, as I will argue in a moment, I think are pretty significant. But that is how a lot of arguments are phrased, saying, well, the Greek phrases are different enough that it should give us pause. And I'm all for pausing and considering it. Absolutely. All right, and then fourth out of five would be the theological reasons. So this is viewed as a salvation issue, according to Hartley, a regeneration issue. And so in Hartley's view, as best as I can understand it, as I walk through his paper, he's basically equating, this as a salvific scenario. And so he seems to have a very high Calvinistic view of God saving his elect and electing some to salvation, opening the eyes, regeneration, all of that. And to be fair, like I totally get that. And James White would obviously fall in that line as well. He's very much in a Calvinistic camp for soteriology. So knowing that as far as presuppositions, that there is a more of a bent theologically to see that God is the one who's operating in a way who either gives or takes salvation away. Because remember, what is being said in 2 Corinthians 4:4 is the unbelieving mind, they're blinded to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel. And so contextually, there's a big theological reason for saying, well, this has to be God then, theologically, because God is the one who either gives or withholds salvation. Nobody can thwart salvation. And so I can, empathize with that. I also have a high view of God's sovereignty and salvation. And so that would be tempting to argue from those grounds. And I'm not going to say that that is definitive for them. I'm just saying that it's a consideration, right? And our theology often, we have to take care not to let our theology just run over a passage. And I'm sure that they would do the same thing for that. But that is a consideration, right? And one of the things that's important to understand is that, well, this would be my take, even if we're going to say that Satan is the one who is blinding them, is that God is still ultimately in control of that, right? And he can be sovereign overall and orchestrating something to happen. And then, he can use secondary causation through Satan, through someone else, etc. And I think a good example of this would be in 2 Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicles 21. Okay, so they're parallel passages in Chronicles and in Samuel. And in 2 Samuel 24, it says that God was angry with Israel, so God incited David to sin. Okay, so it says that he's the one who stirred up David to make a census of the people and all of that. And realistically, that could be difficult theologically at some point. But then if you read 1 Chronicles 21, what's interesting is that 1 Chronicles 21 says that Satan is the one who stirred up David's heart to sin. And you might say, well, how do we reconcile that? In fact, some people have said, well, that's a contradiction in Scripture, but I think it's actually explainable from the perspective of God's sovereignty and then the intermediate agency of Satan. And there, I do think it is a proper name because the article is lacking in the Hebrew, which typically is in names in Hebrew. And the Septuagint, the Greek translation of 1 Chronicles 21, also translates it as devil, diabolos. And so it seems that we are justified to take this as a reference to Satan. And so the interrelationship between that would be God working over everything. He's the one who's sovereign. And then ultimately Satan is working as well as, God's worker. I think that that's how we would understand that. And so there are theological reasons at play why I think somebody might be more inclined to say that, God is the one blinding the minds of unbelievers. But just admittedly, regardless of what view you take, this is why I don't think it's a huge deal for where you end up landing on this, just because ultimately you should hold both truths in tandem, that God is in control. That is so true. And ultimately he is in control no matter what secondary causation he uses. But you also have very real effects and workings done by the devil and the demonic realm. Okay, so I think that is in play regardless of which view you end up landing here, is you acknowledge that God is in control, but you also have the devil at work. Okay, And the last, so I've kind of organized these loosely to kind of hit the last reasons as probably the most compelling in my mind. And so the last reason here is that there's probably an allusion to Isaiah 6, 9 through 10 here. So Isaiah 6, 9 through 10, I just want to bring that up on the screen here. So Isaiah 6, 9, and 10 is the calling of Isaiah, and he said, "Go and say to this people," this is God telling Isaiah, "keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people dull and their ears heavy. Blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed." Okay, so this is a very impactful passage because God is giving Isaiah a commission, which is going to ultimately end in not the salvation of the people, but the dulling of their senses. As they hear the truth, it dulls their senses, and they are incapable of responding to the Lord. Okay, and so that's what's being talked about here. And the Lord is ultimately, presumably the one who's taking effect in doing this, right? Sovereignly, he's the one who's orchestrating this. Now, I think that this is absolutely true. Obviously, it's in the Bible. Isaiah 6 is true. But the difficulty of this passage is that there is, the concepts are there for the conceptual tie-ins. But again, I'm looking for some very concrete. Obviously, if there is a genuine allusion here to Isaiah 6, the vocabulary doesn't match very well. And so that's the difficulty, is that, when I'm training myself or trying to be sensitive to where there are echoes and allusions in Scripture to other passages, I really want to see those and know those because they're so crucial. But I want certain vocabulary or synonyms to be used there to help make that connection. I just don't see that here. I see thematic connections of the dulling of different sensory organs, but obviously mind isn't there. And you also even have different ideas of how the hardening or the blinding takes place, different wording that's used. Now, you might be able to explain that away just saying, well, that's because there is, the different organs are being used there. And I get that. And that's why I say it's a thematic connection. And I think that it's true that God is ultimately sovereign behind that. But again, that doesn't disqualify, secondary causation. Now, I think how some people might try to argue against this, and I can't remember exactly how Hartley phrased his take on this, but I think some people in trying to approach this would say that in salvific matters, God, is in control. Like Satan can't, snatch somebody away. You can't have Satan, entering the salvific sphere, and that seems to be what 2 Corinthians 4:4 talks about. But again, it's, I think that's more of a theological consideration. I think exegetically, ultimately, we're just trying to deal with, what's present in the text. And I guess let's put it this way, I'm not convinced that thematically, Isaiah 6 talking about the hardening of the sensory organs for the people of Israel and the hardening that takes place elsewhere in Scripture, all those things can be true. And I don't think we necessarily have to say that we are, dealing in a salvific matter. I mean, Isaiah 6 is pretty complex, and obviously Hartley wrote his dissertation on it. But I think that there's more to it than just salvation, okay? And I think he would probably agree with that. And in 2 Corinthians 4:4, I think there's more to it than just salvation as well, okay? Than just salvation. And, you think about how it's phrased in 2 Corinthians 4:4. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. Well, I think that, there's a relationship there to the light of the glorious gospel, right, of Christ. But the blinding it does not have to be limited just to like regeneration or gospel or anything like that. Obviously, it's all related. But I'm unconvinced that, tying it into salvific matters prohibits there being a secondary agent that causes this or something like that. So hopefully I represented Hartley somewhat effectively. And I'll post the link to his article so that you can assess it. But now I want to kind of assess the arguments for Satan and why I think those are a little stronger than the arguments for Yahweh. Again, I think cumulatively, when you take those points, people would think that they're stronger. But I think ultimately, some of these points that I would make, hopefully, at least the way I'm thinking about it, would show that there's explanations for those arguments as well as even additional positive presentations for why someone would view it as Satan, which has been the historical viewpoint of the church and the majority viewpoint, with some exceptions early in church history, for which we'll talk about in a moment. So, why would I argue that 2 Corinthians 4:4 and the God of this world should be a reference to Satan? Why would I argue that? Okay, so I think the first argument would be that Paul's theology often emphasizes the role of Satan. Okay, and I think this is a really undervalued point, but especially in the book of 2 Corinthians, but I would add 1 Corinthians in there too, since it's the Corinthian correspondence, you have Paul often emphasizing Satan and his role in how the world works, okay? So Satan as a name appears in Romans 16:20, 1 Thessalonians 2:18, 2 Thessalonians 2:9, 1 Timothy 1:20, 5:15. So that's outside of Corinthians. So obviously 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times outside of, and this is, for, Paul's writings. So, Paul's mentioning Satan a lot by name, but then he also talks about Satan as the devil. So the devil appears in Ephesians 4:27, 6:11, 1 Timothy 3:6 and 7, 2 Timothy 2:26, 2 Timothy 3:3, Titus 2:3. And then he also refers to the devil by other names as well. So he refers to him as the tempter in 1 Thessalonians 3:5. He refers to him as the evil one in 2 Thessalonians 3:3. He refers to him as the ruler of the realm of the air or the power of the air in Ephesians 2:2. So all of these references are contributing to Paul's overall theology of the Christian life and the battle against, the principalities and powers, which become a big theme with him and something we'll talk about, Lord willing, in the next episode. Now, within 1 and 2 Corinthians itself, I think that this is helpful because Satan appears in 1 Corinthians 5:5, 1 Corinthians 7:5, 2 Corinthians 2:11, 2 Corinthians 11:14, 2 Corinthians 12:7, right? Now, Satan is referred to as Beliar in 2 Corinthians 6:15, which was a common Second Temple reference to the identity of Satan, or at least Paul seems to assume that, incorporating that into 2 Corinthians 6. And then Satan is also referred to as the serpent in 2 Corinthians 11:3. And then he also probably encapsulates Satan in the rulers of this age phrase that he uses in 1 Corinthians 2:6 and 8, because that seems to be similar to how he refers to the principalities and powers and things like that. Now, let's give you just a perspective on Paul's usage of Satan, okay? So in the New Testament, Satan is referred to in 33 verses, all right? So I just ran a quick search. So Satan is referred to in 33 verses, all right? Now, outside of the Gospels and Revelation, which obviously have the most references to Satan, so outside of the Gospels and Revelation, there are actually only 12 references to Satan by name as Satan. There are other references to devil, etc. But at least by name, Satan only has 12 references outside of the Gospels. Those 12 also include in Acts. There's only 2 references to Satan by name in the book of Acts. All right, so 2 Corinthians has the highest frequency for just the name of Satan. So 2 Corinthians, you have Satan being referred to by name 3 times, and including 1 Corinthians, you could summarize that 5 times. So in the Corinthian correspondence, outside of the Gospels and Revelation, about half of the uses of Satan are in the Corinthian correspondence, okay? So And that's not including the other references, which we could tabulate that, and that would probably increase, the visibility of what's going on. But obviously that's clear that in the discussion with the Corinthians, Satan is a big theme. Okay, so a very major theme with regard to the book. All right, so that's a very undervalued point. I actually haven't seen people talk about that a lot, but it's something now with word searches and things like that we can do very easily, is just see, wow, like Paul is talking about Satan a lot, but Paul is talking about Satan a lot to the Corinthians, and so that's a huge contextual factor, right? So second of all, so that's the first thing. Second of all, people have argued that John's phrase, the ruler of this world, which shows up in John 12:31, John 14:30, and John 16:11, it's been argued that phrase, the ruler of this world, is significantly different than Paul's phrase, the God of this world. Okay. Now, one of the key differences there is the difference between cosmos and aion. Okay. So aion is often translated age, although many English translations do translate it as world, because the semantic overlap does seem to include that. But whether you translate it as world or whether you translate it as age, in some instances, it might be helpful to keep a strict distinction between those terms, but there is semantic overlap. But as I mentioned earlier, one of the telltale signs of John's writing is for his preference for cosmos. Okay, and he uses cosmos a lot. In fact, I should have done a word search for cosmos. Somebody else can do that. Drop it in the comments or something. Tell me how many times he uses it, because he uses it so much. And he uses cosmos a lot to define the evil world and all those things in the world system. D.A. Carson actually has a really good section on that in his commentary, just how cosmos tends to represent this evil system that is anti-God. And so John prefers that. And in all of his writings, so in John, 1st through 3rd John, and then Revelation, John uses aion as a word 41 times. But, catch this out, he only and always, and that's always, that's like a repetition there. That's always a very big deal if you can say it is always used in a specific way. So John only and always uses the word for age, aion, in a prepositional phrase, which in your English translations would be translated forever or never, depending on whether it's negative or positive. So he only uses it in the temporal sense. Okay, so 41 times in all of, because John's written a lot, John, 1st through 3rd John, and Revelation. So anytime you're reading like forever, it'd be the phrase like eis ton aion, which in Greek would be like for the ages or to the ages. And we translate that as forever, basically. And the odds of that being a coincidence are quite staggering, right? You can't just say that that's a coincidence. Much more likely, in fact, we would say that, okay, clearly John has a style, and he does. And that style, obviously, and if you look at how aion, which remember can be translated as age, how that's used by other New Testament authors, the gospel writers, Paul himself, if we look at those sections and how those gospel writers use that word, John is so different, right? So by trying to argue, and part of the reason for that, I would contend, is that John writes so much later, right? I know my preterist brethren would not like this, but one of the interesting things about John's writings is that, the hypothesis is that he's writing after 90 AD. So that's, essentially 30 years after Paul and his writings, give or take a couple years. And a lot can happen in that time. Maybe your style is different to begin with. That can happen anyway. But, there is a little bit of a difference there in how things are formulated, how things are thought about. And so that would explain why John has slight differences in how he's, and by the way, this isn't the only area that John has differences in phraseology. There have been a lot of people who have studied those things. So the arguing that cosmos and aion are different, I think that's fine, but we have to look at how John uses cosmos and aion And we would have to say, okay, clearly cosmos is fulfilling a lot of the same role that Ion is fulfilling in many of the other authors. Okay, so that's part of being a good student of Scripture and trying to check what the author is doing there. So I would argue then, the big conclusion of that is that there's not actually a difference between cosmos and Ion, at least in how John seems to use it. Okay, so that would just be how I'd throw that out there. Also, the idea of the ruler of this world versus the God of this age, obviously they can have different nuances, ruler and God, but they also have significant overlap. So here's where Philippians 3:17 comes in. Paul clearly uses God in that context to refer to a power or a force that rules over them. So in Philippians 3:17, you remember it's the same grammatical construct with the article, ha theos. And so if he's saying, their God is their belly, basically what he's saying, he's referring to, he's implying is that their belly is the one that rules over them, right? So I think all that to say, when people say, the phrase in John does not match with what Paul's trying to do at all, I would say, well, I think there's a lot more similarities than what we would give it credit for. And so I would personally say they are quite similar, and I think that the evidence would bear that out. Third argument for this, which we talked about, a little bit here, but Paul does use the articular form of theos, ha theos. He uses that elsewhere to refer to not Yahweh. And he also, so we looked at Philippians 3:17, and he also admits that there are other gods. So we see this in 1 Corinthians 8:5, which I'm bringing up on the screen here. He says, "For although there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords." So in English here, the ESV has quotes around there, but there are no quotes in Greek, right? So we're doing that for the sake of the reader, saying there are, but Paul's phrase would have just been, there are many gods and many lords. And we know that Paul is making a play here because in verse 6 he says there is one God, the Father, from whom, but that's for us. For Christians, we recognize that this is true. But there are many so-called gods, those that are called gods, right? And so, I think that this is to the Corinthians. And so Paul shows us that there are many gods, quote unquote, right? And, I think then it's not surprising that Paul regularly uses this kind of idea. And I think, by the way, I'm bringing up Philippians 3:19. I think I've said 3:17 a few times. I don't know. My brain wasn't working exactly. So it's 3:19. Philippians 3:19 says, "Their end is destruction. Their God is their belly, and they glory in their shame with minds set on earthly things," right? So this is something that Paul does, is he's able to use that terminology. And by the way, that's the same phrase, ha theos there. So again, if you're just looking at it in Greek, it's going to be very, very similar to the previous phrase. And in Philippians 3:19, then we see that, the God that exists for, these people who are going down the wrong track, it's their belly. It's the one that governs them and controls them. So grammatically and theologically, both with 1 Corinthians 8:5 and with Philippians 3:19, we recognize that it's both grammatically and theologically acceptable to use this kind of language. So Paul does it regularly. And to the Corinthians, in fact, we have evidence of that, but we also have evidence elsewhere. But you also have Paul theologically setting up this point in 1 Corinthians 8, and then grammatically, Philippians 3:19 gives us the exact same occurrence, not to Yahweh, but to something else, okay? And then this is, I think, another important argument here, is that Paul's view of this age is negative. And he uses the word to refer to the evil system, okay? Now, this is very important because in 2 Corinthians 4:4, it's the God of this age. And I don't think people who try to make it Yahweh give enough thought to what is this age in Paul's writings, okay? So Paul's view, the God of this age, is very, very negative. And so to me, this is one of the most persuasive points, okay? So I just want to rattle down a list. I wrote down a bunch of verses. I'm just going to rattle them off here for you. So Romans 12:2, Paul says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." So that phrase, "do not be conformed to this world," okay, that's ion, the negative world system. Don't be conformed to the ion. Don't be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. 1 Corinthians 1:20, where's the wise one? Where's the scribe? Where's the debater of this age? Okay, so where's the one who's debating? Where's the one who's playing for your team? Let him come and debate us, kind of idea. God would make this debater of this age foolish, right? So again, playing for the world, being a part of this age team. Similarly, 1 Corinthians 2:6, yet among the mature we do impart wisdom, although it is not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age, who are doomed to pass away. So that's kind of an interesting theological point, is that in the first letter to the Corinthians, Paul explicitly said that the rulers of this age are doomed to pass away. And so if later on he tells the Corinthians, there's someone who is the God of this age, well, that would be kind of confusing maybe to them if he had just said those who rule this age are going to pass away, and then says, oh, by the way, the God of this age, has blinded. Well, he's going to pass away soon. So again, I just think Paul's going to be very consistent between 1st and 2nd Corinthians in his terminology and how he thinks about this. So the rulers of this age in 1 Corinthians 2:6 are doomed to pass away. All right. So again, very strong language there. A couple of verses later, 1 Corinthians 2:8, none of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would have not crucified the Lord of glory. 1 Corinthians 3:18, if anyone among you thinks that he is wise in this age, let him become a fool that he may become wise. So again, pitting this age against God's experience there. Galatians 1:4, this one's very powerful. The Lord Jesus Christ, who gave himself for our sins to deliver us from this present evil age. Okay, so again, in Paul's theology, this age is the present evil one. Ephesians 1:21 talks about far above all rule and authority, power and dominion, and above every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the one to come. So again, that could probably, that's not strict evidence of anything. It's just talking about the rulers and authorities that are in this age and in the one to come. Ephesians 2:2, however, is a little stronger, in which once you walked following the course of this world, which would be the age of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience. So there again, following the age that belongs to this world, okay? So again, there's a constant reference there. 2 Timothy 4:10, Demas, in love with this present world, that's the word for age, has deserted me, gone to Thessalonica. Titus 2:12, the grace of God has appeared, training us to renounce ungodliness, worldly passions, to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age. Again, providing a contrast there. Yeah, I just think if you look through the data here, if you run the searches yourself, I think we understand that this age is quite evil. Okay, so I think that's what's at stake there and important to recognize. Okay, so I would say this is one of the most persuasive points, is that in Paul, now there are other uses of age as well, okay, like in the Gospels, but in Paul especially, this age tends to be negative and associated with the evil system. And I just think, you go through a lot of the examples, they show that. All right. A fifth argument that could be put for as a counter argument against Yahweh being referred to as the God of this age would be 1 Timothy 1:17, because in 1 Timothy 1:17, Paul refers to God as the King, the immortal, invisible. He's the King of the ages, Paul calls him. So it'd be interesting. It's kind of interesting if he was the God of the age rather than the God of the ages, right? Which is what God's title should be, because he doesn't just belong in this evil age, but he is the God of the ages, just like Paul refers to him as the God or the King of the ages in 1 Timothy 1:17. So again, just trying to use Paul's theology, I think that God in relationship to the ages, he would be the King of all ages. I think that this makes a lot of sense to me. Now, all those evidence, I've tried to fly through that, okay? So I think that all of these arguments make a compelling case for me that what Paul is referring to in 2 Corinthians 4:4 is, the agency of Satan, the real effect of Satan that he has in combating, against the world, God's created world, and in many ways, destroying things, messing things up. All those things are in play. Now, the question is, why is it that the minority view of taking Yahweh, why would that even come about then if this was so clear? And so I do think that there is an explanation for this. And actually, I want to do something I don't often do, or at least not in my mind, I don't often do it. Maybe you could tell me if I often do this, is that I want to do kind of an extended quote from John Calvin, actually. So in reading some of Calvin's comments on this, I thought he was actually quite helpful in kind of saying why some of the church fathers did not hold to Satan being the God of this world. So he held to Satan being the God of this world, but he comments on why some of the church fathers did not, okay? So this is his take on it, and I think that he makes a compelling case for this. So Calvin says, "No one that judges rightly can have any doubt that it is of Satan that the apostle speaks. Hilary, as he had to do with Arians, who abused this passage so as to make it a pretext for denying Christ's true divinity, while they at the same time confessed him to be God, twist the text in this way." And he gives the quote here, "God hath blinded the understanding of this world." In this, he was afterwards followed by Chrysostom, with the view of not conceding to the Manichaeans, their first two principles. What influenced Ambrose does not appear. Augustine had the same reason as Chrysostom, having to contend with the Manichaeans. Okay, so what he's basically saying is that, starting off, you had Hilary, who was doing battle with the Arians, and the Arians were using this text to say, well, look, Satan can be referred to as God, and so just because Jesus is referred to as God doesn't mean that he has true divinity, because Satan doesn't have true divinity, even though he's referred to as God. And so you could tell that would be pretty compelling for some of these individuals to say, hey, since we're doing battle with the Arians, let's go ahead and read the text in this way, which again is actually we need to remember that we're not outside of our context either. And so I know that there are things in my life I just wish I, actually knew them, that are being influenced contextually by the battles that I face or the books that I read or the current cultural crisis. So just remember, we are biased in many ways, okay? And so that's why true exegesis, we're trying to get rid of our biases and just go after the authorial intent, right? So Calvin goes on and he says, "We see what the heat of controversy does in carrying on disputes. Had all those men calmly read Paul's words, it would never have occurred to any of them to twist them in this way into a forced meaning. But as they were harassed by their opponents, they were more concerned to refute them than to investigate Paul's meaning." And then he goes on to say, for Paul says elsewhere, "Many are called gods," 1 Corinthians 8:5. "But David, on the other hand, sings forth the gods of the nations are demons," Psalm 96:5. "When therefore the devil is called the god of the wicked, on the ground of his having dominion over them and being worshipped by them in the place of God, what tendency has this to detract from the honor of Christ?" In other words, what he's saying is this shouldn't detract from the honor of Christ. It's just a statement of fact that people are trying to supplant Christ as God with Satan, right? And that's the God of this world is the God of this world to the people who are in the world because they don't recognize Christ as God. I couldn't help but thinking as I was reading through that quote by Calvin when he says, "See what the heat of controversy does in carrying on disputes." I couldn't help but think, as I was studying infant baptism, I see Calvin and Luther like exemplifying that in many ways. I know my Paedo-Baptist friends would say like, no, they were right. They were right. Well, there are actually, I think, some good reasons to say that the controversies surrounding the Anabaptists actually pushed Calvin and Luther into improper exegesis of some passages, and Zwingli as well. I think Zwingli is even a better example of that. So we definitely need to be careful of that. And I think that would explain why there are some individuals in the early church who are actually taking the Yahweh view, and then it falls out of favor significantly. And so it's such a minority view to say that Yahweh is the God who blinds the minds of the unbelievers in 2 Corinthians 4:4. But historically, there were more people who viewed it early on in the church, and I think that's explainable because of the Manichaeans and the Arians and their heresies that involved the person of Christ. And, I think that that's helpful to understand. So with regard to that, I think it's helpful to understand the historical background and where some of those come from. Now, ultimately, I think that we want to be evaluating the evidence in and of itself. And so hopefully an episode like this has helped you do it. If you end up saying, I think Yahweh is the God of this age who has blinded the minds of unbelievers, again, I think that that's totally fine. I don't think that there are any red flags for holding it. I just think that the evidence is very overwhelming on the other side. And I gave you my reasons. And if you disagree, I guess we just have to go to the parking lot and fight. That's all there is to it. That's all there is to it. No, I'm just kidding. But I hope this is helpful. I have to run, so we have to wrap it up. But really appreciate you taking the time to listen. And as always, if there's any feedback, whether positive or negative, I always appreciate hearing it. I genuinely do. So if you're ever on the fence about that, saying, oh, should I tell him that I don't think he was right on this or that I didn't appreciate this, please just let me know. I really do appreciate that. And I always appreciate listening to people who've heard and watched and want to give feedback. I try to do most of my interacting on the comments on YouTube. And if you reach out through email, Lord willing, I'll get back to you soon. I just am backlogged on those and I'm slowly making my way through it. So hopefully, if you emailed me and never heard back, know that I will, Lord willing, get back to you soon. So if you want to reach out to me, you can find petergeeman.com, the contact form there. If you want more information on Shepherd's Theological Seminary, you can visit shepherds.edu. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face shine upon you.